My boyfriend's friends snickered, right there at the table, like my dignity was some kind of after dinner entertainment, and for a second I honestly wondered if I had misheard them. But then I saw the way their mouths tilted, the way their eyes flicked to my plain clothes, the way one of them leaned in like she couldn't wait to land the punchline. "Does she even make enough to pay for her own food?" she said, loud enough for the table to hear, soft enough to pretend it was a joke. And my boyfriend, the man I had loved for 18 months, didn't defend me. He didn't even try. He just looked away. I remember the exact moment my chest went tight, like my body knew before my mind did. The air in that upscale bistro downtown smelled like expensive perfume and butter and something citrusy that felt too bright for what was happening to me. The menu didn't list prices. The portions could fit in your palm. The kind of place that makes you feel like you need to sit straighter just to belong there. I had gotten there first, ordered water, and waited, telling myself this was normal, meeting 3 of his closest friends. The people he'd known since college, the people he had talked about like they were family. Then they arrived about 10 minutes later, sweeping in like they owned the place. Designer bags, perfect hair, that whole polished performance where every laugh sounds rehearsed. My boyfriend kissed my cheek, introduced everyone, and I did what I always do. I shook hands. I smiled. I made small talk. I tried to be warm without trying too hard. At first, they were polite enough, asking what I do, where I'm from, how we met. They were the kind of people who could wrap judgment in a question and still make it sound friendly. My boyfriend works in fashion marketing, high-end brands, influencer events, the whole scene. He lives in a world where image is currency. I've always kept a lower profile. I dress simply. I drive a 10-year-old sedan. I don't flash money around. It's just how I am. He knew that from the start, or at least I thought he did. But sitting there, watching him sip his wine and stare at the menu like it contained the secrets of the universe, I realized he didn't just know it. He tolerated it until I had to be seen next to him. When his friends started laughing, I smiled and noted it, because there are times you can feel your own heartbreak forming and you still keep your face calm out of sheer pride. I let them laugh. I let the little underbreath comments land. One of them said something about participation trophy girlfriends. Another one said, "At least she's nice, right?" And the table broke into that thin, mean kind of giggle people do when they think they're above you. My boyfriend stayed silent, complicit in his silence, and that was when something in me went still. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, something clearer. I took a sip of water and decided, right then, that this relationship was over. I didn't make a scene. I didn't throw my napkin. I didn't raise my voice. I just let the evening keep moving, because I wanted to see how far he would let it go, and I wanted to see if the truth would ever show up at that table the way I needed him to. A few minutes later, someone walked up to our table, leaned toward me, and said something that made all of them go completely silent. And in that silence, I watched their faces change one by one, like reality had finally entered the room and they didn't know how to act around it. I'm 35, and until last night, I thought my relationship of 18 months was solid. I thought love meant being chosen in public, not just in private. I thought respect wasn't something you had to beg for at a dinner table. But last night showed me something I can't unsee. And no matter how satisfying that moment of silence was, it didn't erase the one thing that mattered most. He still didn't have my back. Before that dinner, before the silence and the snickering and the moment everything cracked open, my life with him felt steady. Not perfect, but grounded in a way I had learned to trust. I was 35, working independently in investments, managing portfolios, projects, responsibilities that didn't need flashy titles to feel meaningful to me. I liked my work. I liked the quiet confidence it gave me. I liked knowing what I was capable of without needing an audience. He was 33 when we met, magnetic in a way that drew people in effortlessly. Fashion marketing, high-end brands, influencer events where everything looked curated and intentional, from the lighting to the laughter. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party, one of those crowded rooftop gatherings where conversations blur into background noise. He was standing near the bar, impeccably dressed, talking animatedly about a campaign he'd just finished. I remember thinking he seemed so comfortable being seen. He noticed me because I wasn't trying to be noticed. That's what he told me later anyway. "You were calm," he said on our third date. "Everyone else was performing." I liked that he liked that about me. Our early months were easy. Dinners at my place, late night walks, conversations that drifted from childhood stories to future plans without feeling forced. He loved that I listened. I loved that he was expressive, emotional, unafraid to talk about his ambitions. We were different, but at first it felt complementary. He brought color, I brought calm. The first time I noticed the gap between our worlds, it felt small. A comment here, a joke there. He would tease me about my old car, laughing as he said, "You know you could upgrade, right?" I would smile and shrug. "It runs fine." He'd nod, like he accepted the answer, but something in his eyes suggested he didn't fully understand it. When I met his family, that gap widened quietly. His mother was polite but distant, asking questions about my work with a tone that suggested she didn't quite know where to place me. His sister asked where I shopped, then nodded slowly when I named practical brands instead of designers. No one was overtly cruel. It was subtler than that, the kind of evaluation you feel more than hear. His friends were another story. I'd heard about them often. The college trio who moved to the city together, climbed the corporate ladder together, celebrated promotions and breakups together. He talked about them like they were a measuring stick for adulthood. Successful, stylish, well-connected. I noticed how his posture changed around them, how he straightened his shoulders, how he talked faster, louder, how he sometimes looked at me, just briefly, like he was checking whether I fit into the picture he was trying to present. There were signs I brushed off, moments when he introduced me vaguely. "This is my girlfriend," without mentioning what I did, even though he knew. Times when he laughed nervously instead of correcting someone who underestimated me. He never outright disrespected me, but he didn't actively protect me either. And I told myself that wasn't a big deal. 18 months is a long time to build habits, to build assumptions. I assumed that when it mattered, he would show up, that if anyone crossed a line, he would step in. That love meant loyalty, not just affection. Looking back now, I can see how much I filled in the gaps for him, how often I chose patience over confrontation, how I convinced myself that discomfort was just part of blending lives. That dinner wasn't supposed to be a test. It was supposed to be casual, just a meal, just conversation. But the truth is, it was the first time all the pieces of his world were sitting at the same table, watching me. And it was the first time I realized how alone I was in that relationship, even while sitting right next to him. The discomfort didn't begin at the dinner table. It started weeks before, in small moments that felt too insignificant to challenge, but heavy enough to linger once they passed. I remember the first time he mentioned wanting me to dress up a little more when we were meeting his friends. He said it casually, like a suggestion, not a request. "They're kind of into that stuff," he added, shrugging, as if that explained everything. I laughed it off. I told him I'd wear something nice, and I did. But the comment stayed with me, threading itself through my thoughts in ways I didn't expect. It wasn't about clothes, it was about belonging. There were other moments. A work event of his I wasn't invited to, because as he put it, "It's mostly influencers and clients. You'd probably be bored." The way he hesitated when someone asked how serious we were, answering with a vague smile instead of certainty. None of it was enough on its own to feel like a problem. Together they formed a pattern I didn't want to name. The closer the dinner got, the more I sensed his tension. He talked about his friends constantly that week. Their promotions, their trips, their opinions. It felt like he was bracing himself for something, though I didn't yet know what. When I asked if they were excited to meet me, he said, "Yeah, of course," but his eyes flicked away, just for a second. At the restaurant, that tension finally had somewhere to land. It was in the way his friends looked me up and down, their smiles sharp at the edges, in the questions that came wrapped in judgment. "What do you do again? Are you at a big firm? So like, freelance?" Each one landed with more weight than the last. When I said I worked independently in investments, my boyfriend shifted in his seat. I noticed it immediately. The movement was subtle, but it felt loud to me. He didn't correct them. He didn't elaborate. He let the ambiguity sit there, and in that silence, his friends filled in their own story. I watched him study the menu instead of meeting my eyes, watched him sip his wine instead of stepping in. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, that strange mix of embarrassment and disbelief tightening my chest. Part of me kept waiting for him to laugh it off, to say something like, "She's being modest. She does really well." Anything. He said nothing. When the conversation shifted to engagements and rings and real money, I felt something in me pull back. I'd never cared about six-figure rings or being spoiled. I cared about respect, about partnership. And sitting there, listening to them talk about what a woman needs while my boyfriend laughed along, I realized we were no longer on the same page. The mocking question about whether I could pay for my own food wasn't the first cut, it was just the deepest. And the fact that it came after so many smaller ones made it sting in a way I wasn't prepared for. I smiled because I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. But inside, I was taking inventory. Every glance he avoided, every second he chose comfort over courage, every moment he let their opinions define me. By the time the waiter took our orders, I wasn't just hurt. I was clear about what I was seeing, clear about what it meant. Clear that this wasn't about money or status, but about whether the person beside me would stand with me when it mattered. And as the evening moved forward, I felt the distance between us grow, even though we were sitting inches apart. The night crossed a line long before the manager walked over, but the moment it became irreversible happened while plates were still warm and laughter was still echoing too loudly around the table. The food arrived in a practiced rhythm, servers placing dishes down with careful precision, like none of them could sense the quiet tension coiling just beneath the surface. My steak sat in front of me, mid-range, intentionally unremarkable. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I never had. His friends dug into their meals with enthusiasm, clinking forks and glasses, already shifting the conversation to safer ground. Trips to Europe, work drama, someone's disastrous dating app story. They spoke over one another, relaxed now, as if the earlier comments had been nothing more than playful banter. I chewed slowly, tasting very little, watching everything. My boyfriend kept glancing at me, his eyes flickering with something that might have been guilt or fear, or maybe just awareness that something had gone wrong and he didn't know how to fix it. Each time our eyes met, he looked away again. That hurt more than the laughter. About 20 minutes later, just as one of his friends was in the middle of a story, the manager approached our table. He was a well-dressed man in his 50s, calm and composed, the kind of person who ran a place like this with quiet authority. He didn't address the whole table. He leaned slightly toward me, respectful, deliberate. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "I wanted to personally thank you for dining with us this evening. We're honored to have you here." I looked up, surprised but composed. "Thank you," I said. "The food is excellent, as always." "I also wanted to let you know that your meal tonight is on the house," he continued, his voice warm but firm. "As a token of our appreciation, please don't hesitate to let me know if there's anything else we can do for you." The table fell completely silent. I could feel it, the shift in the air, like someone had turned off the background noise. Forks froze mid-movement. Smiles faded. 3 pairs of eyes bounced between the manager and me, confusion blooming into disbelief. "That's very kind," I said, setting down my fork, "but not necessary." "I insist," he replied. "It's the least we can do." He nodded once, respectfully, and walked away. No one spoke for several seconds. My boyfriend's face had gone pale, his expression caught somewhere between shock and panic. The friend with the severe bob was the first to find her voice. "Wait," she said, "what just happened?" I folded my napkin carefully, taking my time. "The owner and I have a business relationship," I said evenly. "This is one of the restaurants in a portfolio I manage investments for." Their eyes widened. I could almost hear the mental recalculations happening in real time. "You manage investments for restaurants?" one of them asked. "Among other things," I said. "I work with a private equity firm. We acquire and develop commercial real estate and hospitality ventures. This bistro is one of about 40 properties in our current portfolio." Dead silence. My boyfriend stared at me like I had spoken in another language. "You never told me that," he said finally, his voice tight. "You never asked," I replied. "You said I worked in investments. I do." One of his friends tried to laugh it off, her voice brittle. "Well, why didn't you just say that from the beginning?" "Because I don't lead with my job title or my bank account," I said. "I thought that's what mature adults did." My boyfriend reached for my hand under the table. I pulled it away. That was the moment everything crystallized. The validation, the silence, the sudden respect in their eyes. It was almost satisfying. Almost. But it couldn't erase the truth that had already settled in my chest. They only saw my value once someone else confirmed it for them. And he only realized what he was about to lose when it was already gone. We excused ourselves and stepped out onto the sidewalk, the night air cool against my skin, the city lights blurring slightly as my adrenaline refused to settle. The door closed behind us, muting the clatter of plates and voices inside. And for a moment we just stood there, facing each other under the glow of the street lamp. He looked panicked, like someone who had just realized the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. "Why didn't you tell me you were that successful?" he asked, his voice low but sharp, words tumbling out faster than his thoughts. I took a slow breath. "I told you what I do," I said. "You just didn't bother to ask follow-up questions." "That's not fair," he said quickly. "I just didn't know. I mean, you never talk about it." "I don't brag about it," I corrected. "There's a difference." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing a step and then stopping. "You have to understand how that looked back there. They were just joking around." I felt something tighten behind my ribs. "They spent the entire dinner mocking me," I said, "and you said nothing. You sat there and let them treat me like I was some broke woman you were charity dating." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I didn't know what to say. "How about, she's my girlfriend and I respect her," I said. That would have been a start. He crossed his arms, defensiveness creeping into his posture. "You're overreacting." The word hit harder than I expected. Overreacting. As if my humiliation had been imaginary. As if my silence had been weakness instead of restraint. "No," I said quietly. "I'm reacting appropriately to being disrespected." He sighed, looking back toward the restaurant door. "They didn't mean it like that." "Intent doesn't erase impact," I said. "And even if they were joking, you weren't. You were embarrassed. You thought I wasn't good enough for your circle." "That's not true," he said too quickly. "Then why didn't you defend me?" I asked. "Not once. Not even a little." He didn't answer. The silence stretched, heavy and undeniable. "I think we're done here," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. His eyes widened. "What? You're breaking up with me over this?" "I'm breaking up with you because you showed me exactly who you are when your image is on the line," I said. "And that's not someone I want to be with." "You're being ridiculous," he said, frustration seeping through. So I didn't speak up fast enough. "Big deal. We can move past this." "No," I said. "We can't. Because this isn't about one dinner. This is about the fact that you care more about what your friends think than about the person you're supposed to be building a life with." I turned and started walking toward my car. He followed, his footsteps quick behind me. "Wait," he said. "Please. Let's talk about this. I'll apologize to you in front of them right now." I stopped and looked at him. "I don't need an apology in front of them," I said. "I needed you to have my back when it mattered, and you didn't." "So that's it?" he asked, his voice cracking. "You're just going to walk away?" "Yes," I said, "I am." I got into my car and closed the door before he could say anything else. As I drove away, my hands shook on the steering wheel, not from doubt, but from the release of something I had been holding in for far too long. He called me 4 times on the way home. I didn't answer. When I got back to my apartment, I sat on the couch in the dark, replaying the night over and over. The mocking comments, the snickering, the way he looked away. The manager's interruption had been satisfying, sure, but it didn't change the one thing that mattered. He had failed the only test that counted. The next few days felt heavier than the night itself, like the impact had finally reached my bones after the adrenaline wore off. I went through my routines on autopilot. Morning coffee, emails, calls, meetings. On the surface, everything looked normal, but underneath, my thoughts kept circling back to that table, that silence, that moment when I realized how alone I had been while sitting right beside the man I loved. He didn't give me much time to breathe. The texts started the next morning. Long ones, apologetic ones, defensive ones. I didn't realize how bad it sounded. "They've always joked like that. You know I care about you." I read them without replying, noticing how often the word "they" appeared, how rarely he used "I." Responsibility kept slipping through his fingers. By the second day, his family got involved. His mother called me in the afternoon, her voice carefully measured. "I heard there was some kind of misunderstanding at dinner," she said. "He's been very upset." "A misunderstanding implies confusion," I replied calmly. "What happened was very clear." She paused, then sighed. "You have to understand the kind of environment he's in. Image matters in his world." "So does respect," I said. "And that shouldn't be conditional." She didn't argue, but she didn't agree either. She talked about stress, about social pressure, about how hard he works. She never once mentioned how I must have felt. When the call ended, I stared at my phone, realizing that this dynamic wasn't new. It was just more visible now. Then his friends started circling. One of them sent me a message saying things had gotten out of hand. Another suggested I was being too sensitive. A third implied I should have spoken up for myself if I felt uncomfortable. Each message carried the same underlying tone. If I had just handled it better, none of this would have happened. That's when something inside me shifted. I stopped questioning myself. I stopped replaying what I could have said differently. I started asking a more honest question. Why was I the only one expected to absorb the damage quietly? He showed up at my apartment building on the fourth day. I saw him through the lobby window before I heard his voice. He looked tired, eyes rimmed red, jacket wrinkled like he'd slept in it. When I stepped outside, he rushed toward me. "Please," he said, "just talk to me." I crossed my arms, keeping space between us. "We're talking now." "I messed up," he said quickly. "I know that. I should have defended you. I froze. I didn't want to make things awkward." "You didn't want to make things awkward for you," I said, "so you let them make it humiliating for me." "That's not fair," he said again, desperation creeping into his voice. "You know I love you." "I know you're attached to me," I said. "There's a difference." He flinched at that. "I can fix this," he insisted. "I'll talk to them. I'll set boundaries. I'll tell everyone exactly what you do." "That's the problem," I said quietly. "You think my worth needs to be announced for it to be respected." He shook his head. "You're twisting this." "No," I said. "I'm finally seeing it clearly." That night, I found myself remembering other moments I'd dismissed. Times when he hesitated to post photos of us. Times when he compared himself to his friends and then looked at me like I was part of the equation he was trying to solve. I hadn't changed. The context had. As the days passed, the pressure intensified. More messages, more apologies, more explanations that somehow centered his discomfort instead of my pain. And with each attempt to pull me back, I felt myself stepping further into clarity. I wasn't angry anymore. I was resolute. Because when conflict escalates, it doesn't always get louder. Sometimes it gets quieter, sharper, more precise. And that precision was teaching me something important. I wasn't losing him. I was choosing myself. The quiet hit me hardest at night. During the day, I could function. I had meetings to run, decisions to make, numbers to review. People depended on me, and that structure kept me upright. But when the lights were off and the city outside my windows settled into a low hum, the weight of everything pressed in all at once. That was when the doubts tried to creep back. I lay awake, replaying scenes I wished I could rewrite. His face at the table, the way his friends laughed, like my presence was a joke they all shared. The moment I pulled my hand away from his under the table, knowing there was no version of that night where things went back to how they were. My chest felt hollow, like something essential had been scooped out and left behind. What hurt most wasn't just the humiliation. It was the realization that I had been slowly shrinking myself to fit into a life that didn't truly make room for me. I had been quiet when I wanted to speak, patient when I should have been firm, understanding when I should have demanded more. There was a night, about a week after the breakup, when I sat on the floor of my living room, back against the couch, and cried harder than I had in years. Not the dignified tears I allowed myself in public, but the kind that left my throat raw and my eyes swollen. I cried for the future I thought we were building, for the version of him I believed in, for the part of myself that kept hoping he would choose me, without hesitation. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, face down. I knew without looking that it was him. He'd been calling every night around the same time, like clockwork. Sometimes he left voicemails. Sometimes he just breathed for a few seconds and hung up. I couldn't bring myself to listen anymore. That night, the loneliness felt almost physical. I wondered if I had been too harsh. If one bad night really was worth ending a year and a half of shared memories. I thought about the trips we'd planned, the conversations about moving in together, the way he used to hold my face in his hands and tell me I was different from anyone he'd ever known. But then another memory surfaced, the sound of laughter that wasn't kind, the way his silence had wrapped around me like a verdict. I realized something then, sitting there in the dark. If I went back, I wouldn't be going back to safety. I'd be going back to explaining myself, defending my worth, proving over and over again that I deserved to be there. That realization broke me in a different way. The lowest point wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation. It was the quiet understanding that love without respect is just another form of loneliness, and that staying would mean accepting a version of myself I no longer recognized. By the end of that week, I felt exhausted, emotionally wrung out. I moved through my apartment like a stranger, touching familiar objects that suddenly felt like relics of a life I was leaving behind. Even my work, the one place I usually felt strong, seemed distant. But somewhere beneath the exhaustion, beneath the grief, there was a flicker of something else. Not hope, not yet, just awareness. I had reached the bottom, and from there was only one direction left to go. The shift didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic revelation, no single moment where everything suddenly made sense. It came quietly, layered over a series of small truths that finally aligned into something undeniable. About 10 days after the breakup, I was having coffee with a colleague, someone who had known me professionally for years, but had only met my boyfriend once or twice in passing. We weren't talking about him at first. We talked about work, about a project that was gaining traction, about how exhausted I looked lately. She studied me for a moment, then said gently, "You don't seem relieved. You seem recalibrated." That word stayed with me. I told her what had happened, not in detail, not emotionally, just the facts. The dinner, the comments, his silence. When I finished, she didn't rush to reassure me or play devil's advocate. She just nodded. "I'm not surprised," she said. I looked up, startled. "You're not?" "No," she replied. "The last time I met him, he spoke about your work like it was an interesting hobby, not a career. I remember thinking it was odd, considering what you actually do." The room felt suddenly very still. "He knew exactly what I did," I said slowly. "I know," she said. "That's why it stood out." That was the moment something clicked into place. Not anger, not vindication, clarity. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't been too sensitive. I hadn't misread the dynamic. He hadn't failed in a moment of weakness. He had revealed a consistent truth under pressure. Later that evening, I finally listened to one of his voicemails. His voice was tired, pleading, layered with regret. "I know I messed up," he said. "I just didn't want them to think less of me." There it was. Not less of us. Not less of our relationship. Less of him. I sat on my couch, phone in hand, and felt something settle in my chest. A deep, grounding sense of resolve. I didn't hate him. I didn't even feel particularly angry anymore. I felt done. For the first time since that night, I wasn't focused on what he had taken from me. I was focused on what I had almost given away, my self-respect, my voice, my expectation of being chosen without conditions. I didn't call him back. Instead, I drafted a single message. It was short, calm, final. I told him I wished him well, but that I was not interested in continuing the conversation. I told him I needed a partner who didn't need an audience to value me. Then I blocked his number. The relief that followed surprised me. It wasn't loud or euphoric. It was steady, like exhaling after holding my breath for far too long. I slept through the night for the first time in weeks. When I woke up the next morning, the apartment felt different. Not emptier, clearer. That was the turning point. Not when he apologized, not when others acknowledged he was wrong, but when I fully accepted that walking away wasn't a loss. It was a decision. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unraveled slowly, the way reputations and carefully curated images usually do, thread by thread, in conversations I wasn't present for and rooms I no longer cared to enter. I started hearing things through mutual acquaintances first. Nothing dramatic, just observations. His friends had been quieter lately. Invitations had shifted. The tone around his name had changed. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then the pattern became harder to ignore. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after I blocked him, I ran into one of his friends, the one with the severe bob, at a coffee shop near my office. I noticed her before she noticed me. She hesitated when our eyes met, clearly debating whether to pretend she hadn't seen me. Then she walked over, her confidence muted, her posture less sharp than I remembered. "Hey," she said awkwardly, "can I talk to you for a second?" I nodded. "Sure." She took a breath, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize for that night. We were out of line. I didn't realize who you were. Not that it should have mattered. We were rude, and I'm sorry." I studied her face, searching for defensiveness, for excuses. There were none. Just embarrassment. "Thank you for saying that," I replied, and I meant it. She nodded slowly. "He's not doing great," she added. "He won't stop talking about you. I think he really cares." "Maybe he does," I said, "but not enough." She didn't argue. She just nodded again, like she understood more than she wanted to admit. As I walked out of the coffee shop, I realized something important. The apology wasn't for me. It was for her. For the discomfort of realizing she had misjudged someone so completely. And that discomfort was spreading. I later heard that his family had started asking questions. Why hadn't he defended me? Why hadn't he been honest about what I did? Why had it taken a restaurant manager's intervention for the truth to come out? The same people who had once prioritized image were now grappling with the cost of it. He tried one last time to reach me, this time through a friend, asking if I would at least hear him out. I declined, not because I was angry, but because I was finished reopening a wound that was finally healing. Meanwhile, my own life began to settle into a new rhythm. Without the constant background noise of managing his insecurities, I felt lighter, clearer. I reconnected with friends I had unintentionally neglected. I poured more energy into my work. I started saying no without guilt and yes without hesitation. I wasn't seeking revenge. I didn't need to. The truth had a way of circling back on its own. His version of events, the one where I overreacted and couldn't take a joke, didn't hold up well under scrutiny. Too many people had seen that dinner play out. Too many had noticed his silence. By the time I realized it, the fallout was complete. Not because I stayed to watch it happen, but because I chose to walk away and let reality do the rest. It's been 2 months now, and the quiet in my life feels different than it did that first week. It's no longer heavy or hollow. It's spacious, intentional, the kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself think again. I didn't rush into healing. I let myself sit with the discomfort, with the grief, with the understanding that loving someone doesn't obligate you to abandon yourself. I took long walks without my phone. I cleaned out my apartment, not just drawers and closets, but habits and expectations that no longer served me. I noticed how often I had minimized my own needs just to keep the peace. I promised myself I wouldn't do that again. Eventually, I did start seeing someone new. Slowly, carefully. Someone who asked questions and actually listened to the answers. Someone who didn't need to see my resume or my portfolio to treat me with respect. Someone who was curious about who I am beyond surface-level markers. There was no performance, no testing, no measuring. Just presence. I heard through mutual acquaintances that my ex had been telling people I overreacted, that I couldn't take a joke, that it was just one bad night. I let him tell whatever story he needed to tell. I knew the truth. I knew what happened, and more importantly, I knew how it made me feel. The truth is, it wasn't one bad night. It was one honest night. A night where I saw clearly who stood beside me when it mattered and who didn't. A night that stripped away assumptions and showed me the cost of being with someone who values approval over partnership. A night that reminded me that dignity isn't something you negotiate. I don't regret the relationship. It taught me what misalignment looks like before it turns into resentment. It taught me that love without advocacy is fragile. And it taught me that being chosen privately means very little if you're not chosen publicly too. If there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this. Pay attention to silence. Pay attention to who speaks up for you when you're not in the room, and who stays quiet when you're being diminished right in front of them. Those moments tell you everything you need to know. I didn't walk away because I was hurt. I walked away because I was awake, and that made all the difference.